Welcome to Climate Preparedness Week, and welcome to the Wellfleet Library, the virtual library. My name is Jennifer Wertgen, and I'm the director of the Wellfleet Library. 2 weeks ago, for those of you that are local, Wellfleet had its town meeting. And for those of you who were there, you will have noticed that there was a commercial single-use plastic bottle ban on the warrant that passed with resounding success. And this was not something that our government decided to do. This was a citizen-led grassroots effort, and it answers the question, what can I do locally, that so often plagues people? And it is my greatest honor to welcome Dr. Madhavi Venkatesan to our virtual Climate Prep Week and back to the Wellfleet Library. Madhavi graciously gave her time to us last year at our Green New Deal panel, and we are so thrilled to have her here to work with her again. She is a Brewster resident and is the founder and executive director of Sustainable Practices, a Barnstable County-focused environmental nonprofit that helps facilitate efforts such as the plastic bottle ban. And I think it's really wonderful that we have something that's happening right at this exact moment during Climate Prep Week. And I am not going to say very much more except that Madhavi is someone who is an economist who was in the private sector, has transitioned back into academia as well as activism, and we're just very lucky to have her here with us in Barnstable County, showing us how to lead these efforts and here with us shepherding the way. So welcome, Madhavi.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I appreciate that.
And I apologize for butchering your name.
We're in a country that's still learning its melting pot marketing. If it had done a better job, I think the name would be easier for all of us. So it's not a problem at all. Thank you for hosting this with me, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share a few insights that I hope will be helpful to people and beneficial to everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, I am an economist. I didn't probably have as much love or affinity for my discipline as I do today. When I was a student, I didn't really learn the direct tangibility between being an economist and the way the world operates. And I think that's probably true for many of us, because unfortunately, the way that we teach economics, especially at the introductory levels, that almost every student in the United States, if you go to college, is introduced to, rarely often tells people the tangibility of those theories that they are coming into contact with in the classroom. So I'm hoping that in our little discussion, I will take you down memory lane a little bit, but hopefully also provide you with some tangibility with regard to concepts that you may have learned at one time. The primary discussion point for me with you today is to, first of all, differentiate between two things. Almost everyone has heard about macroeconomics, and some people are also somewhat familiar with microeconomics. The one thing that I think it's very important to understand is microeconomics is economics. Macroeconomics comes into being in the 1930s. And so what we're looking at here is a situation where we were looking at things in context, gives you a totally different perspective than when you look at things from 1,000 feet up, down. So I want to definitely make that very clear for you. And I think what I'll hopefully say will make quite a bit of sense. When we look at policy and we look at a policy prescription where we take into consideration a general rule of how people behave as opposed to a context-based rule as to how people behave, we may actually miss the mark, because what we look like on average may not even depict what our society looks like in real terms. So let me just give a simple example. I could have one person making $10 and one person making $100. The average is 55. I could also have someone make $60 and someone make $50. The average is still 55. But we would probably prefer to be in a society where the average is more indicative of the range of values than a society where the average doesn't necessarily express the true polarization of values. So that's one thing that macroeconomics unfortunately does. And I hopefully will delve into that together a little bit more, and also discuss why that may be problematic, especially given that even though we all live within the economic framework, economic literacy is not an important element enough in this country that everybody leaves high school with some basic understanding of how they actually conform to economic theory, as well as have an opportunity to change it. So I'm hoping this will make sense on multiple levels, and I look for you to correct me if it doesn't. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is related to economics and climate change. Obviously, that is the title of our program. So the biggest sources of greenhouse gases, because that's typically what people highlight when they think about climate change, but climate change and greenhouse gases is just one thing. And I'm hoping that when we get to the end of this discussion today, you'll see what this huge conundrum is, because we're focusing on one thing, but really what we need to do is focus on the human-centric or the human impact to the planet. Climate change is just one attribution of it. But if we only think of it from that perspective, and we look to solve just this one issue of greenhouse gas emissions, we are not necessarily changing the value prospect, the value basis for the issues that we face today. So let me share what that means. First of all, in terms of the largest sources of greenhouse gases, we're most familiar with this, the number one being transportation, energy generation, then going on to commercialized agriculture. All of these relate to what we call in economics as externalities. And for many decades, we actually simply refer to them as market failures. And by so doing, we don't really acknowledge them as something that needs to be internalized. In other words, we need to get rid of these market failures and ensure a market system that doesn't really have them. That externalities should not be appropriate or something that we would accept, because they actually create the social justice and economic justice and environmental justice issues that we deal with on the other side of the equation of our market system. But unfortunately, maybe it's an economic literacy problem. Maybe it's the fact that we live in a society where we really don't engage in critical thinking. Maybe it's because it is easier to take the fruits that exist than question how they came into existence. I don't know there, and I would say that more than likely it's a combination of multiple channels of factors, which is another hopefully topic that we will discuss a little later, which is all related to stakeholder engagement. So when we just look at these sources of greenhouse gases, let's just focus purely on carbon emissions. We're going to focus on GDP growth. So global carbon emissions from fossil fuels start to take off right around 1932, going forward, actually starting much more quickly in terms of the steepness of this line by the 1940s. The reason why this is sort of interesting to look at is because when we look at the carbon dioxide and then we look at GDP, we can see that there may be a direct correlation between the two, and just looking at the steepness of the slope. So what is GDP? So let's talk about that for a second, because that is a primary motivating factor of our economy and something that almost all of you have come into contact with, but not necessarily something that all of us sit back and contemplate what it means, especially not on the individual level. So before I do that, let me just show you this graphic. And I looked to update this one, but I really couldn't. It's not really been updated, but we are above 400 parts per million. As of September 16th of this year, we're at 411.66 parts per million, according to one data source. And the reason why that matters is that's where we're measuring climate change, really what we're talking about, the speed of climate change behavior. And I really want you to think about that. We use the word climate change, but this graphic, as you can see, depicts very easily to you that over 400,000 years, we have always had climate change. We just haven't had it at the speed that we're having it today. So when we talk to our friends who may not completely understand this, I think if you start to talk about the speed of climate change as being faster than any time we have ever known it in the last 400 years, and that's the problem because we don't have the ability to adapt to it, that makes a lot more sense, and it's probably a lot more true a statement than to say climate change is a man-made phenomena. That's fine. It probably has been a man-made phenomena in other time periods as well, but no other time has the speed been this great. But let's go back to what I said a moment ago, how this affects us because of our economic model. So in the United States, our model for quite some time has been very production-based. We look at producing more. There's a lot of there's a lot of innovation that we value, a lot of technological progress which we value, and we will talk about that in a moment too. But that all has come out of the process of energy generation. And the primary source of energy generation has been fossil fuels. So oftentimes you hear people say, oh, the reason why we have climate change issues today is because of India and China or other BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China being the BRICS. That's not true. If we look at carbon dioxide, which has approximately anywhere between 500 to 1,000 year half-life, we have to look at it on a cumulative scale. So when you look at it on a cumulative basis from 1875 to 2011, the largest single contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, specifically carbon dioxide, has been the United States, at 27% of overall global emissions. The next highest is the EU, which is a combination of 28 countries, and that's at 25%. So yes, maybe on an annual basis, some of these BRICS or developing countries have started to increase their production and therefore their emissions by using fossil fuels. Well, those are just emerging risks. They're emerging compositions of that overall cumulative impact. And the other thing I'd like to mention right here, and I'm going to be saying a lot of different things at different points because I wish I had so much more time to spend with you, but we have so little time to spend together. But when we look at these emerging countries, the one thing we also have to take into consideration is when they're having these emissions, for whom or who are the beneficiaries of those emissions? If they are manufacturing for export, should those emissions be counted against those developing countries, or should the exporter be the country that's being exported to, be the one that's given that attribution? And the reason why I say this is because we do know that a lot of countries that have regulations to protect their domestic populations have exported their production processes overseas, increasing the amount of emissions in those countries, but really only doing so to provide goods and services to their own countries or the developed world. So this is the concept, and this is an important concept that I'd like to bring up to you because it relates to the Paris Agreement, which we will only be able to touch on for like 2 minutes unless somebody asks some questions related to this, but it's the common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, that's the acronym. What that means is that we all have common responsibilities. This is all our planet. But our responsibilities are differentiated based on multiple factors. It could be differentiated based on our wealth position. It could be based on the fact that some of us gained from the degradation of the environment, whereas others did not. And therefore, those that gained from the degradation should have to pay more into it to help, because it doesn't seem fair otherwise. So what you're really talking about when you talk about CBDR is a concept that's often misplaced in economic thinking completely. But it surfaces throughout all discussions of the United Nations, specifically related to sustainable development and the sustainable development goals. And that word is morality. Because when we talk about fairness, that is essentially what we're talking about. What is the morally correct thing to do? Why would you want to impose a situation on people where they have to suffer for something that they did not contribute to? So it's alien to us to think from that perspective, because we have for so long been able to benefit from not thinking from that perspective. So let's talk about economics now. So when we look at, this is our standard GDP equation. Our GDP equation is basically, which is your gross domestic product, is based on a few basic components. The first component is consumption. Then we have investment, government spending, exports minus imports. So consumption spending in the United States is the #1 component of GDP. Every aspect of our policies, fiscal policy, monetary policy, are all focused on maintaining consumption expenditures. So in the US right now, approximately 69% of our GDP is what we call personal consumption expenditures, PCE. Investment spending is property, plants, and equipment, things that you can think about in terms of thinking about how a company would choose to make investments for its production, to make supply. Government spending, obviously, is supposed to be related to taxes. An ideal situation would be your government spending is equal to taxes. But there are times that you take on debt because you want to ensure that you can kickstart your economy. Unfortunately for us, we're in a kickstart paralysis. So our debt keeps on increasing, but that's a different matter altogether. Exports minus imports gives you an idea of the demand for your goods and services externally. But the part that I really want to talk about is consumption. Because when we talk about climate change, and I just went through showing you how production in this country directly ties to the emissions of carbon dioxide, and it does that for any country using fossil fuels. I also shared with you that the US on a cumulative basis has the highest proportion of those global emissions over time, and those will stay in the atmosphere for some time. So therefore they should be attributed to the US. But we want to know why. Well, I showed you a graphic which showed directly how GDP growth has increased. So the 1940s is when the GDP metric that we're looking at right here becomes a global metric. And there's a great story behind that, because when we start to talk about the developing world and we talk about how they have a lower GDP, some of that is also attributable to cultural differences and unpaid work. And we won't have, unless you ask a question, I'm planting these seeds for you to ask this question. So think about it. If you're in a monetized situation, in a monetized economy, and the only way you validate GDP is if there's a monetary value given to something. If you're in a country where the work is unpaid, it's not that the people aren't productive. It's just that it's not attributed to a dollar value because it's not a market-based value. So these are some of the misconceptions that also come out of this indicator. And that's just something that we should talk about later if you have time. And the reason why it's important is when we start to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and what that means, but also our perceptions of other people in other countries are often linked to a monetary perception. And money cannot capture everything, but we have really tried hard to make it capture almost everything, including our sense of what happiness is in the United States. So money and accumulation are our fundamental proxies in the United States for happiness. And that's what we've been marketed to. And that's why you can ask young people, which I teach in college, you know, what is it that you're going to college for? The only thing they can tell you, because they haven't been ever taught to think about this, is the idea of making money to buy things. They have basically embedded an economic model in their minds in terms of their whole life without ever recognition or being taught that this is an external thought, this is an external model that was only created to measure output, not to validate our life existence. So the problem with consumption in the United States is this. Most of it now, because we're developed, is happening based on products that were created outside the US. So consumption is taking a toll on the global environment, especially because in the US we have this beautiful market veil. We get to go to a store, we don't see the harm that was done to the commercialized animal. We don't see the harm that was done to vegetative life in another country because we now have a desire to have coconut milk every day. We don't see how our coffee habit, which because we're paying too little for the resources embedded in the making of that coffee, is actually creating and promoting climate change because of the degradation to natural forests, other places in this country. We've been taught, and here in Massachusetts, I think all of you can imagine what I'm talking about right now. I mean, I'm from Tennessee. I'm from New York too, Jennifer, but I grew up in Tennessee. I went to Vanderbilt. So one thing that we did in Tennessee, if we had an animal that died on the side of the road, they'd come and pick it up. In Massachusetts, they have basically allowed us to think of animals that die on the side of the road as not even having been living things because they just lie there until they're smashed into the ground. So our way of cheating things allows them to be lacking in animation and therefore be thought of things as opposed to responsibilities that we may have to their protection. That's what I'm trying to get at when I make that example. We call it roadkill. We don't clean up when they die. What have we essentially done but put them visibly to our young people as being the lowest of value compared to a human life? So I'm putting these things out there for you to start to think to yourself in terms of our social dynamic, how we actually help promote a consumption pattern that is basically amoral. It's devoid of our responsibility because it's in the market, it has a price, therefore I can afford to pay for it. It is a fair value. I can do with it what I'd like. We have not told or taught people enough that when I buy this tree, when I buy this teakwood furniture, trees have been chopped down somewhere else, which could potentially lead to erosion and issues related to environmental health well-being. Plus, I may have may have stolen a home or a habitat for another living creature that had no voice except for the voice that I gave to it. So these are the issues that our consumption really helps promote. And these are the issues that underlie climate change. So let's think about one more step back. Climate change activity, according to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change through the IPCC, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, has been attributed to something that's occurred in terms of the speed of climate change activity that we see today for something over the last 70 years. Over the last 70 years, that's basically the same period where we have, on a global basis, adopted the GDP economic indicator. So basically, during that same time period, we have created the wild goose chase of production as being an indication of a country's economic status. So we have been propelling that production, and because production has to is compelled based on demand by consumers, we have manufactured or marketed demand to people, this whole market system that we live in. And then, given the fact that we do not engage in critical thinking, we have never really promoted on the individual level people to sit back and think, what is the supply chain behind this? What is the harm of my potential consumption choice? Instead, what we have is a system that fundamentally has prices, which is, I'm drawing the equilibrium price, which would be supply and demand intersection for those of you that remember from principles. And then people feel that they're fair to purchase whatever they want over here. And then they look over on this side and they say, oh, there are poor people and there's environmental injustice occurring over here, not ever occurring to them that the amoral economic system that we live in is actually creating these conditions over here. And as St. Augustine noted, charity is a very poor substitute to justice denied. We deny justice within our economic system, and then we throw charity as though somehow we worked harder or deserved more, and therefore it will help these other people who did not help themselves by giving them something back in return. And the ironic thing about that is, in economic theory, we have a assumption of rationality. And that the assumption of rationality for many of my economist colleagues basically means that if you see someone in an impoverished position, they chose that position to be in. It simplifies the social welfare paradigm in the sense that I don't have to be held responsible or accountable to someone else's context. Their context is of their own choosing. So these are some of the underlying issues when we talk about climate change, and also talk about the ramifications that also exist related to climate change. So this is where I spend most of my time. And some people say economics is a quantitative discipline, and sociology, psychology, anthropology, really, what are you doing with all these things in there? I will tell you two things. One, disciplines are human-made. They're social constructions. So there's no such thing as economics is only this. Secondly, economics started off as a moral philosophical discipline, and it became quantified so that it could be a more science-oriented discipline, because when you incorporate math, you somehow gain greater credibility. But math does not make you objective. Math just depicts the subjectivity of the researcher. So my perceptions of reality get mimicked in the equation. Computer programs, for example, are not objective. Computers are not objective. They mimic the perceptions of the programmer. So the unfortunate thing is, when we start to treat human life and interactions as a science, we basically normalize the behavior that we see around us, as opposed to putting a normative framework on the behavior we see. So instead of saying whether this falls short of the values that would be good for a society, we just basically accept what we see. And that opens a discussion for a whole lot of other things, which are related to the whole realm of social construction, legitimization, and power dynamics, which we won't be able to have time to get into, but I really would encourage you to think about that. So when we think about our economic system, what's currently happening is our GDP system, because it relies on consumption, has driven a certain set of values, which we see. Any of us over 50 easily can see this. What we have seen is, when we grew up, we thought more communally, but as we've continued to move in our age, we become more individually focused. Well, there's a reason for that. Marketing things on an individual level will lead to more return than promoting a shared economy. right? So our values are driven currently based on our economic growth trajectory, our economic growth model. But what we're seeing right now, and I'm very happy to be seeing this right now, as to how the traction will be, who knows? We can only hope that we have our own purpose in our lives and that will drive the traction. But what we are seeing now are people whose eyes are awakening and opening up to the fact that it's our consumption patterns, it's our behavior that has led to the actual environmental degradation and climate issues that we're seeing today. And as a result, there's an understanding, increasingly greater understanding, that it's our choices that have to be the conduit for change. And this is happening on the grassroots level. There's often discussion by people that they say to me, well, we need to have regulation from the federal level down. That's not true. There's more evidence to point to the fact that grassroots movements work in terms of actually creating change that is permanent than if you have it imposed on you and you don't understand why that change is happening. So there are two levels of changes that probably need to happen today. One, people need to be cognizant of the fact that freedom is a responsibility and that we have to reinsert a sense of moral obligation into our consumption. And then we need to also have that codified so that we can limit certain types of behaviors so that they aren't harmful to everyone. So there are two things, but you're more aligned to probably doing the reacting to legislation in terms of the intention of it when you understand what the intention is. So you definitely need the power of localized movements. So what my hope is that these grassroots movements we're seeing starting to take hold will actually start to change the values that are within our economic system, and perhaps then create a different indicator for us to value ourselves by. Maybe a gross national happiness indicator, which is an existing indicator, but maybe something that's more aligned to truly what makes people happy than just having things. So just in terms of climate change activity, which are the next few slides I'm just going to share with you just to give us some context, global temperatures have risen for some time. So the mean, which would have initially been right here in this area, is now moving up over 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now it's a little bit more than that. So these are just estimates. We know that over time, in terms of temperature, in the last few decades, we've seen an increase every decade in terms of temperature. So what does this mean? This means that basically we're moving to uninhabitable living conditions in certain places in this world. And why is that important? Well, some people will talk about it from the standpoint of economic growth, which we'll talk about in 1 second, but I'm going to talk to you about it from a different perspective. When we see refugees and we see people who don't have anything of their own and are looking to basically survive, and we don't help them, thinking about especially that this is an outcome of the production levels of certain countries, we do something that really harms us long term, in my opinion, which we can put an economic value to. And that is that we slowly erode our sense of humanity. And as you erode a sense of humanity, you create a fear-based culture where you don't want to be the one left out. And I'm going to leave you to contemplate what that means. We already are in somewhat of a fear-based culture, but as climate change activity continues and we have more refugees and we have more issues related to climate change and we are not open to helping people, instead we open the window to starting to think about otherness again and picking and choosing, we will eliminate or reduce our sense of humanity, which will change our culture in a different way than where we really want to go. We want to go to one that actually has greater sense of moral perspective, that looks to eliminate and reduce injustice, not one that looks to promote it. So those are my opinions, and those are my thoughts for you to think about. These are just other issues related to climate change and the impact to the world. You know, we are having higher increased incidence of weather-related activities. So downpours have increased, volatility and severity of weather-related events. These are some just amazing photographs that show and depict this. And the issues here are massive erosion, of course, obviously flooding, which damages property and also affects human life. There are multiple sources, one of them also being vector-borne disease. So climate change, two things, right, that we've just discussed: increased temperature, incidence and severity of weather-related events, and increase in vector-borne disease. And some of this we already know because we're starting to see it in the United States. But this particular little example right here that I'm going to share with you is related to Colorado and trees. So this was stated in 2015, but actually in 2020, somebody else said that climate change is a medical emergency in the US. And unfortunately, the reason why I just said somebody else is because I'm drawing a blank and telling you the exact name. But climate change is actually going to be tied to fires, as some of you already directly know about what's happening in California. The fire seasons have increased, and actually they're greater than 105 days now. But what happens with fire is also that you have increased inability to produce food. So now there are four things, right? I've said that we have incidence and severity of weather-related events, increased vector-borne disease. And I should just mention the reason why that increased vector-borne disease is because the seasons are longer, so they can actually have two reproductive cycles, and they can move across geographies as a result. So that's one of the main reasons there. Increase in temperatures can also increase and erode the ability for vegetation, but also increases the incidence of fire. And both of those in combination with one another can actually reduce the amount of food available on a global system and a price point where all countries can compete for it. So again, on the food index, wealthier countries are able to buy the food which their people can throw away because they have a higher income than poor countries. So there is an issue there too. And so the next thing is water. And water is a very tricky phenomenon. I'm going to just talk about a couple simple things to you. Water, we have water scarcities everywhere, including the United States. And the thing that people don't completely understand, looking simply right here at what my nonprofit is working on, plastic water bottles, is that water bottle took up 3 times the amount of water to manufacture than the water it holds. So that means that our consumption has a huge resource footprint that we're not aware of, because again, we go to the market, we can buy it for $1, so therefore we think it's worth $1 because the costs of actually manufacturing it are externalized to other people, the environment, or some other vulnerable entity that cannot speak up for itself, or is in desperate enough situation that will take whatever it can give. Our overconsumption is promoted by our measurement of what supposedly makes us happy, which is our gross domestic product. So this is the connection we have. But the problem is those indicators that I mentioned, like gross domestic product, have taken a life of their own now, because people are not directly understanding the connection of what that's supposed to mean to happiness or quality of life, even though those were never meant to be proxies. The GDP was when Kuznets, who created the indicator, spoke to Congress, he said this should never be used for anything other than production capacity. It is not a good quality of life indicator, but we say we use it that way anyway. The issue is that it can't be a good proxy if people don't understand how the dollar value doesn't clearly mimic or provide information on the true cost of the product that's being consumed. So that's the issue across the board here. There's so much more I could say than that, but I'm just going to go to a couple more slides and then give you an opportunity if you have any comments you'd like to make. So water scarcity, of course, affects more than 40% of the world. These are the cost of carbon. I'm putting it up here so that for one point, and one point alone. This is the absurdity of our economic system. The reason why we don't have a necessary desire to take into consideration internalizing our externalities on some level is because we actually can grow our economy by fixing all the damages that we create. Isn't that crazy? So that means it's okay to sell plastic water bottles knowing that people are going to have health issues 20 years from now, because hey, we can monetize their health issues by giving them medicines or giving them some type of treatments to help alleviate these issues that they get. So there's an absurdity within our economic system because we're putting the value on the dollar not necessarily the actual true indicator of the quality of life. So there is a great paper that I read, and I actually use this quote in one of my other papers, and I'm going to paraphrase, and I know I'm going to paraphrase badly, so I'm going to ask you to forgive me all right now. But the paper basically says the ideal economic agent is not the man who marries his high school sweetheart and lives a very healthy life, growing vegetables in his own garden, and never has any kind of health issues. The ideal economic agent is the chain smoker who marries, can't have a stable family life, and has to remarry again and again and again. And because he has a poor diet and eats out all the time, has a lot of medical expenses. And the reason why is because the first person who lives a life that's, we would all claim to be probably a little healthier, who's emotionally happier, doesn't put enough money into the system because he doesn't have any real problems. The other one does. So the point is, again, in another simple way, we are measuring the wrong thing. And in measuring the wrong thing, we are creating the wrong outputs, the actual exact opposite of perhaps what really would make us happy and fulfilled. So where do I think the solutions lie? These are my solutions. I certainly don't think we go out and put up solar panels and wind turbines. I think we have to change the way we actually look at the world around us. And one of them is perhaps me to take a step back. And some of you probably recognize this man and look back at the culture of Malaise speech that Jimmy Carter gave almost 40 years ago. And the main reason why I would say that is in this culture, the State of the Union address, Carter clearly notes that we are becoming, because he's seeing the transition happening, we are becoming a nation of consumers. We no longer find happiness with our friendships. We don't make time for our family. We are concerned more about having things. That's one thing he says very clearly right off the top. The other thing he also says is we're in the middle of energy crisis at this point in time. He says it's your patriotic duty to reduce the consumption of energy so we can reduce our dependence on foreign oil, because at that time we had a dependence, huge dependence. The moment the crisis went away, our dependence on energy only increased. That's why I'm saying we don't need to go out and make more panels and put more wind in. There is no free lunch in our system. The more that we use of anything, we're going to cause some other emerging risk to come into being. What we need to do is start to analyze what we need. What kind of world do we want to have? What matters to us? And set a purpose that's beyond a GDP accumulation or how much money we make purpose. That social mission statement is what is fundamentally missing in our country today. Religion at one time perhaps had that mission, but as we became heterogeneous in terms of our religious beliefs, it was hard to have one singular religious belief that transcended everyone. And that's where, on a secular level, on a national level, devoid of a religious foundation, we need to have some sort of value that we have as a society with regard to how we see ourselves, so that when we looking at production, we are at least anchoring it to something that has meaning to all of us. So I ask you all to think about that, because we really don't have that. There is no social mission statement. There is no unifying ideology. And therefore, we iteratively seek to find happiness and satisfaction and sustainability, but we're not doing it in unison. So the first term of sustainability, first use of the word sustainability, and I know I'm taking up too much of my time. I hope I have just a couple more minutes, Jennifer. But when we think about the word sustainability, which is what I focus on, sustainability actually came into meaning in terms of a word that was used by the United Nations in their Brundtland Commission report in 1987. It's this thing, the reason why I'm putting this up here is because I find this so fascinating to me, because when I was going through my economics training, this to me would be the definition of what economics is: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In other words, development that takes into consideration resource utilization, so I maintain there's enough resources available for the future. And that is really basically the definition I grew up with when I was in my undergraduate and graduate programs. But over the last 30 years, that definition of economics has changed. And we don't talk about economics in terms of intergenerational bequesting or intergenerational transfer. It's become more individualistic, with satiation or immediate gratification being determined right now. Okay. This is the part that I think is really interesting, and I wanted to put this in here for you. So in 1987, the same commission says we can no longer talk of economic and environmental policy in separate compartments. So I want to ask you something. Why were we ever talking about them separately? And that's really one of the problems here. The problem is, the reason why we were talking them separately is because somewhere along the line, in the last 70 years, earlier in those 70 years, there was a perception that somehow the human system was the dominant system and the environmental system was just a subset of it. So in other words, humans could fix anything. Or we had technology, we could do whatever we wanted. We didn't really need the environment. And that's where the transition starts to happen. So it's sort of sad to think, in a resource-based discipline, which you immediately say economics is a resource-based discipline, that you would have to sit back and think to yourself, aha, we need to think about the environment too. It seems like it would be quite logical you would have done so. But we truly did become a world where the human perception of domination of this planet actually superseded any other perception. And that's what we're challenged with today. So whether we overtly think about it or not, these types of thoughts are within our institutional frameworks. They are within our implicit process of thinking about things. And so this is where we really have to engage in critical thinking. Of course, this is the Paris Agreement, where the Paris Agreement was signed. And this is the relationship to common but differentiated responsibilities. If we ever have time to speak on this issue, I'll really welcome it. But this is the whole issue of, who should be paying and why. And does it really matter whether it was our great-grandparents that benefited or not? In some way, shape, or form, we continue to benefit based on where we live. And shouldn't we make sure, because we don't want to lose our sense of humanity, that we protect the most vulnerable? Because we can. That's hopefully how we should be thinking. So in terms of what I would suggest in terms of a sustainability social mission, we want to promote strong local economies. And I'll explain this to you. In economics, oftentimes you hear people say, oh, we don't need any more regulation. We don't need government. Well, it's because they're taking economics out of context. We don't need regulation when everybody works together. If we're a strong localized system, then we already have self-governance, because you're dependent upon me and I'm dependent upon you, and we recognize our interdependence. But when we're a large entity, we don't recognize our independence. Our interdependence, excuse me. We feel an anonymity factor, which allows some people to do things that they probably wouldn't do if they knew they were going to get caught. So strong local economies, communities, places where people know each other and understand that they're connected to each other, extremely important if you want to reduce regulation. Internalize the externalized costs. If we really thought about the impact of that plastic bottle, which Jennifer kindly brought up, what Sustainable Practice is working on right now, we would have recognized, hey, this is a petroleum-based product. In 2050, it's going to be 20% of the greenhouse gas footprint on this planet. On top of it, the chemicals leach into the water, especially when the bottle expands and contracts, causing obesity, endocrine disruption, fertility issues, cardiovascular issues, ADHD, things that have been normalized in our society over the last 40 years. And then at disposal, recycling is a myth that we were marketed to believe existed because it helps promote selling their products, right? And then, of course, we have incineration and landfilling, which to me should be a red flag to all of us, that we are so sophisticated that we take non-biodegradable waste and we put a hole in the ground and we bury it. That in and of itself, I think, should cause a lot of people a moment of pause, because there is something truly inconsistent about being a progressed society and doing something like that. So this last third bullet right here, fostering zero waste and cradle to cradle production. First of all, neither of those have really been done yet. So this is an area that really has tremendous entrepreneurial capabilities attached to it if we can figure out how. It's easier said than done to think of a good or that is zero waste. And it's easier said than done to think of something as a cradle to cradle product. At some point along the process, no matter what you're producing, the resource footprint is probably in excess of the benefit of the consumption. So in other words, almost everything that we do as humans leads to a footprint. The question we have to ask is, what footprints are we willing to live with and what footprints are we not? So we really need to be realistic. And we also have to take into consideration, who are we looking out for in terms of the benefits to be accrued? Are we opening our eyes to see ecosystem damage and biodiversity loss as also aspects of human benefits? So the last part is promote social equity and stability. Social equity has to do with opportunity for everyone and everyone having an opportunity to live comfortably and have a decent existence. And stability means that that existence continues for everyone, regardless of where they live. This is somewhat tied to the Sustainable Development Goals, but maybe not all of you may be aware, but the Sustainable Development Goals threshold for poverty is quite low. It's $1.90 a day. And the greatest poverty that any of us face is not necessarily income, but our inability to interact socially with others. So looking at just a simple caloric intake component of staying alive is perhaps not the best indicator to assess poverty. So this is the Sustainable Development Goals. I have a book that came out last year on Sustainable Development Goal number 8. And hopefully, if I meet my deadline, this one on Sustainable Development Goal number 12 will come out later in early 2021. I'm just putting this here because I honestly love this quote. I also love the Margaret Mead quote that never question whether a small group of people can make a difference, because they always have. I'm so fortunate that I have a small group of people that I work with on Cape Cod, and we are making a difference. So if you want to question whether that's possible, I'm very happy to introduce you to any of them. And I'm so thankful that a couple of them are on this call with us today, like Ginny. I can see her on my screen. So this is what I'd like to leave you with in terms of thinking. One question I asked my students, because we were having this debate in my class the other day, which is about whether we're naturally cooperative or competitive. And one of my students said, of course we're naturally competitive. None of us would give up our last bit of food for somebody else. And I said, is that really true? Sit back and think to yourself, we're all mortal. We're all gonna go. Doesn't it matter to you how you go? And I think when we start to think about it from that perspective, it changes our relationship to our selfishness. So I'm hoping that that will give you some food for thought to think about, is that it's not necessarily that we're all competitive or selfish, it's that we're taught to be because of fear. But when we start to think about our own mortality, hopefully we think about our legacy, because it's not something we can avoid. And that's really the basis of thinking of sustainability. So this is a picture of our planet, and this is the last slide that I have for us. And I'm happy to take any questions or any comments that have come up, Jennifer. Thank you so much for all of you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask that you put your questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask Madhavi. So if people could just take a moment.
Can I go off screen share? Should I do that?
Yeah, that would be great. Can you please speak to why it is so important for civic institutions such as libraries to advocate and embody sustainable practices, especially in terms of cultural habits and values? Also, that in context of citizen identities being erased as community members and neighbors into consumers.
I think the first part of that question is more appropriate for you to answer, Jennifer, since it's directly asking about libraries. And then maybe the second part of the question, maybe you could rephrase for me.
Well, I think it's incredibly important for libraries to be involved in sustainable practices in all sorts of civic engagement. And I think that's part of what Climate Prep Week is all about. people talk about libraries being political or apolitical, or there's a lot of controversy about that, but I always say there's no sort of other side to basic human rights, and this is one of those issues. And it's a great way for us to be able to share discourse, to be able to share resources, to be able to share with each other in forums such as this, to have information for you in print, in recorded, in many different formats, and continue to look at the biggest issues of our times. And I only hope that that continues to become something that's larger and larger with libraries, and that things like Climate Prep Week take hold everywhere. I know my colleagues in other states are incredibly impressed with what Massachusetts is doing, and are really hopeful that they can do some organized events as well. The second part of this question is citizen identities being erased as community members and neighbors into consumers. I am not 100% sure what that means, and we do not have a lot of people in this, so I'm going to unmute Gabrielle and have her ask that question herself.
Oh boy. Hi everyone. Hi Madhavi.
Hi, how are you, Gabrielle?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. And so basically the question that I'm asking, so our keynote speaker this week was Eric Kleinenberg, the author of Palaces for the People. And in his book, he has revitalized the term, which is social infrastructure. And social infrastructure, just as a brief definition, is this idea that communities and societies, we depend upon not just our buildings and, you know, economic systems, but really it's the people. And it seems so intuitive and self-evident, but you know, social workers, librarians, all of the people who make up civics, and how we as community members interact and what that looks like culturally. And so the question that I'm asking is, because I think about this a lot, of how we have systems that are designed for profit and we have systems that are not designed for profit. So a library is a perfect example of that. And I think about this of how do you create systems that parallel our capitalist infrastructure? How do you create systems that, you know, for example, if I go to a grocery store or I look at all of the different, you know, the massive infrastructure dedicated to consumerism, what does it look like, right, to have an infrastructure that parallels that? Whether it be, you know, libraries, having seed libraries, you know, repair, you know, fix-it clinics, thrift shops, things that are, you know, dedicated to thinking about resources and how we can better, you know, reuse things. And I personally just feel like one of the ways in which the, you know, that capitalism and this sort of corporate way of thinking has been so effective is that it has taken people and said, you know, government is bad, government is terrible, right? Without acknowledging the fact that we are the government and that civically, like, that we elect people and we represent ourselves and we elect who we, you know, who is represented. And so in that way, what they're not really saying is that in the same way that, you know, corporate CEOs and executives have infiltrated the government, is that that it's like we, you know, are no longer, you know, community members, we're no longer, you know, our own government, we're no longer citizens or neighbors, that we're consumers, and it's very isolating and individualizing. And I guess that's really, it's more of a, it's partly a statement, but I do think about, I do wonder, you know, what your thoughts are about that in terms of the rhetoric. And I guess that's what I'm getting at. It's the language that they use to make it so that people can't even imagine, right? They've co-opted the language and the narrative that we use.
I think it's all very important that we think about how we got to where we are in context rather than the cross section where we see ourselves today.
Mm.
Because our ability sometimes to criticize or critique our existence or what we see comes with the hindsight that we also are the beneficiaries of in many ways. So to just in terms of trying to posit what you've noted as a question, I would basically say that civic entities will mimic the society that they are a part of. So perhaps if we're looking at a civic entity mimicking more sustainability, it's related to grassroots movements that help promote it. It may not necessarily be the civic entity that is the catalyst. It may be the people that are the catalyst, but the civic entity then being a partner in that. So I guess going back to the first end of your question or comment, Gabrielle, I would say that the library can be a catalyst by promoting activities and opportunities to educate the public, given that there at least is some seed of interest in that direction. And to get that seed of interest in that direction, you do need the public itself to be engaged. So it's more of a synergistic response as opposed to the entity itself being the conduit of that response. That's what I would say. But may I go to one comment from Julianne, just because I couldn't help it, I read it, Jennifer.
Sure.
She asked, she said, yes, Julianne, if you would email me, I'm more than happy. I don't know who Julianne is, but be more than happy to share some other resources with you. I did go through things quickly because I had such a limited amount of time with you. And what I unfortunately, I think what I have to say is so important. I always want to tell as much as I can of the story because unfortunately, we don't talk enough about the story. And it really is very simple. It's just supply and demand. Supply and demand only works if both people are equally strong in that market. As long as one of them is weaker, supply and demand, especially if there is no morality in that marketplace, will only confer an equilibrium outcome or a price that indicates the strength of the relative strength of exploitation of one of those two parties. So if we can just start to simply understand that, that's basically that in conjunction with the consumption mindset as we've been taught that's how we are happy as we have more. Those two elements in and of themselves could really make a huge change in the world that we know.
Thank you. So that somebody asked what are the first steps for transitioning our economy towards one that has better values for our environment and our society.
Yeah, the first step is not to think national. Think about your next door neighbor and whether they understand where their freedom ends and yours begins. And think about just how we can start to interact in our general communities with regard to elevating the level of responsibility we have towards one another. All politics is local. On multiple levels, you can think of that. But the number one level is that you can vote in your town and your vote has a whole lot more meaning than it has in a national election. You can make the differences that then will roll up and affect on a national level, on a local level, and it can impact the towns around you. And if you think that this isn't true, I am just one person and there is absolutely nothing special about me. I just happen to have been around for a while, but I was able to start an organization because wonderful people decided to join me in it, and we have made a difference. In 2 years, we have eliminated today 6 towns will no longer be able to sell single-use plastic water bottles, and that might not seem like a big deal to you, but that's half a grocery store aisle that's gone. Number one. Number two is it impacts greenhouse gases, it impacts human health, and it gets people to start thinking, why should I buy other foods in plastic? And then it also does something else. It tells corporations that it answers to the people, not the people answering to corporations. It's a complete dynamic, a change that comes from the coalescing of people coming together because a few people were willing to stand up. And that is where we start. There is no quick fix. Unfortunately, one of the other elements of our society is this idea that instant gratification has to be had. We have lost sight of the fact that our gratification should truly come out of making long-lasting change where we don't necessarily have to be the beneficiaries of that change. So I may never be the beneficiary of the change or the world that I want to see. But if I know along the way of my life, I at least plant the values that I hope will be the life for someone else, then my life would have been a purpose-driven life. And that is a conversation we need to have when we talk about economics. And that's the conversation we need to be talking about when we talk about changing the way that we look at the world around us.
So somebody else wants to know, are you saying that things like the development of offshore windmills, for example, is that just going to continue the present level of consumption?
Two things. People think somehow have this mindset that solar panels and wind generation are sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
How are they sustainable?
Mm-hmm.
When the product ends, because it only has a finite life, it also gets landfilled. It was never thought about in terms of a cradle-to-cradle production process, number one. Same thing with your electric cars. They're still using fossil fuels, majority of them, which means that all you've done is taken the decentralization of fossil fuel emissions in terms of automobiles and centralized them to where they're actually being generated, where the electricity is coming from. The only way we are going to reduce the impact that we have on our planet is to reduce our sense of entitlement in this planet. Everything has a cost, and are our benefits individually so great that other animals need to be paying that cost, that other people need to be paying that cost, that the future, which won't be materializing, will be paying that cost? So what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter whether it's going to draw increased consumption. Even if we maintain the consumption as it is, it's not helping, because it's just transferring one problem to another. It's this whole idea of saying, oh, let's have some biodegradable plastic. Okay, that doesn't make any sense either. It's a convenience product, which means that I'm using it for less than 10 minutes and I'm throwing it away. The resources it takes to grow the products that create this convenience product that I use for 10 minutes need to be accounted for. The waste and the decomposition time needs to be accounted for. We still are not getting it. We're still looking at the same model that we live in as being a solution to a value problem. Our values have to change, and the model has to mimic a value-laden system.
Thank you. Well, it's almost 10 after, and I know that there are a lot more questions, but I don't want to keep you any longer. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has just been so amazing. This has been recorded. We will be providing a recording of this on Wellfleet Library's YouTube channel. I know that Crew will be sharing it as well. And I hope that you will all share it with people so that we can all be learning from this, because I think it's incredibly important. And it is a very different mindset, and it's one that we can all really take to heart, especially as we're thinking about the way that the environment and social justice intersect. This to me, it really, really hit home, and it makes a lot of sense. And I just want to thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Jennifer. I truly appreciate this. I just want to give my email address just in case anyone wants it. It's a really simple one. I'm not going to give you my name. It's going to be our nonprofit's name, and that's contact us at sustainablepracticesltd.org. So contact us at sustainablepracticesltd.org. Sustainablepracticesltd.org is our website. So if you have any interest there, it has not been updated to reflect Harwich and Eastham taking on the bottle ban today, but it will be later. So those are the 6 towns that we have passed. And I'll just repeat that for some of you. Brewster was the first, Wellfleet, then Falmouth, then Provincetown, then today Harwich and Eastham. Eastham passing easily, Harwich giving us the one drama that we needed this season. I hope we won't have any more, but it was a big drama event. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate the time, and I hope that there was something of interest for all of you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.